So now that brings us to the consequences for mankind. Consequences that we're still experiencing today. First, we're given the consequences for the woman because of the fall. In verse 16, to the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception, speaking of pregnancy, and in pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. You know, the consequences of sin, and I want you to see this. I think this is so insightful for us today. The consequences of sin were not just a loss of God's blessings. They were actually a reversal of God's blessings. What God intended to be a blessing to man now becomes a curse. The benefit now becomes a burden. The first aspect of Eve's consequence involves pregnancy and childbirth. You know, Eve was given the unique privilege of being the mother of all of the human race. In verse 20, we're told the name Eve means the mother of all who live. Pregnancy and birth were intended by God to be part of His blessing upon women. But now, as part of the curse of sin, what was originally intended to be a blessing becomes a source of multiplied difficulty, sorrow, pain, and injury for women. You know, up until recent history, pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous for both the baby and the mother. In many parts of the world, even still today, childbirth is the leading cause of death for women. It's pretty uncommon here in the United States, but worldwide, over 300,000 women a year die in childbirth. And 2.5 million babies under 1 month old die. This is part of the consequence, part of the curse of the fall. This unique blessing for women has become a source of sorrow and a source of pain. And so the first consequence involves childbearing, and we see here in verse 16, the other consequence involves her relationship with her husband or her marriage. Look at verse 16 again, the end of the verse. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Man, I'm glad that you're at home and not here for this. Just kidding. But remember that the consequence is the reversal of the blessing. It's the reversal of the blessing. Originally, as we've seen in our study of the book of Genesis, originally God created man and woman together, equally made in His image. Both were given dominion over the earth. Both were to be fruitful and fill the earth and subdue it together as husband and wife, as a team. They were supposed to be a team working in partnership together to fulfill God's purpose. But now, as part of the consequence of sin, it says, Eve's desire shall be for her husband. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, there's only one other place that we find this word desire in the Bible. And it's actually just in the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, if you want to look over there. Here, God is speaking to Cain, and He says in verse 7, if you do well, you will not be accepted. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. But you should rule over it. This word desire, it means to control. It means to master. It means to rule over. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God established an order in the marriage with the man leading the family. But as a result of the fall, we're told now that as a result of the fall, the wife now desires to control the man or to rule over the man. In other words, this ideal partnership in marriage is changed into a competitive relationship now because of the fall, with each person fighting for control over the other, both trying to be the head, both trying to rule, resulting in a marriage that is contentious instead of harmonious, resulting in a marriage where you no longer view your spouse as your partner or your teammate, but a threat and a challenge, a challenger. And every marriage has experienced this to one degree or another. And maybe some of you, over the last few weeks of being home together with your spouse, maybe this has really magnified the tension in your marriage. I read an article recently that said this quarantine will result in a boom in childbirths in 9 months from now and a boom in divorces. And I hope there's more childbirths. And you need to recognize, if that describes you, if there's this tension and this competitiveness in your marriage, you need to recognize and understand that this tension and this competition is a direct consequence of the fall. And you need to understand that God can transform your marriage relationship if you and your spouse give Him the opportunity to, and you surrender your life and you surrender your marriage to Him, and you obey His word, you obey His instructions concerning the marriage relationship. You know, God has a lot to say in His word to married couples. He gives very clear and specific instructions to married couples in His word, in Ephesians chapter 5, for example. In Ephesians chapter 5, it describes two people that, first of all, they're filled with the Holy Spirit, and that's key. Two believers that are filled with the Holy Spirit. Because you can't do this without the Holy Spirit, without His power at work in your life. Where now you're filled with the Holy Spirit, and the husband is instructed to love his wife and give his life for his wife, just as Christ gave His life for the church, and the wife is instructed to respect her husband. And here, when you have two believers, two people that have committed their lives to Jesus Christ, that are surrendered to Him, surrendered to His will, and they're filled with the Holy Spirit, God can transform that marriage. He can make it something new, something that glorifies Him. So that's the consequence for the woman, for the wife. Now we have the consequence for the man, or for Adam, in verse 17. Then to Adam He said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife. And here the idea is, you've listened to your wife instead of listening to what God said. It's not that he listened to his wife, it's that he didn't listen to God. And you have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. It's interesting that the consequences for the woman have to do with children and her family, and the consequences for the man have to do with his work. Generally speaking, women are more focused on their family, and men tend to be more focused on their work. And that's where the consequences are.